Day is 11th October, and international headlines continue to be dominated by the situation in the Middle East, specifically the fighting in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, which still continues. Now, there are lots of reports about missile strikes by Hamas against Israeli towns, especially Ashkelon. There are lots of reports, in fact, these are more than reports, these are confirmed reports of Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, apparently intensifying airstrikes on Gaza. There appear to be artillery exchanges. I say artillery exchanges, though of course the weight of artillery that Israel can bring to bear, by definition, is going to be much greater than what Hamas is capable of. Though so far, Hamas does seem to be able to match Israel, or at least to maintain pressure on Israel through its increasingly sophisticated and numerous rocket attacks. And there's also been exchanges of fire across other parts, other borders, others of Israel's borders. There continue to be fire exchanges with Hezbollah, the Shia movement in Lebanon, which controls an extremely effective and powerful military force, and which is, of course, closely allied to Syria and Iran, and which in 2006 fought Israel to a standstill in a war in southern Lebanon. Anyway, there have been exchanges of missile and artillery fire between Israel and Hezbollah in the north, and there was reports of an exchange of fire between Israeli and Syrian troops on the Golan Heights. I should say that for the moment, however, there is no sign of a Ukrainian ground offensive towards Gaza, though everybody expects that at some point soon it will come. Presumably, the Israelis are continuing to assemble their forces, their tanks, their infantry fighting vehicles, and of course, since this is to a great extent a reserve army, they're continuing to call up reservists, place them with their units, perhaps do whatever refresher training is needed to bring these reservists up to a level where they can be deployed in combat, in a combat zone. And alongside all of this, the rhetoric is intensifying to, I find, disturbing and frightening levels. I've seen statements coming out of Israel that from this point on, precision is not going to be Israel's concern. Doing harm, damage is, apparently. This has been said by apparently an Israeli military official. There's talk, increasing talk about destroying Gaza, ending this problem once and for all. There's other rhetoric of this kind. There's been some pushback, I notice, from some people in the European Union about this. Josep Borrell, for once, has spoken out against it and has given warnings about war crimes. But overall, the response has been very muted. And there have been the usual claims about atrocities. Claims, I should say, made by both sides, but the one that is all over the media this morning, at least here in Britain, is a claim that Hamas fighters beheaded children and infants, and there's been lots of reports on it. The Daily Telegraph was leading with the story right through all of yesterday. It was their major headline. And of course, as one can imagine, in Britain, the tabloid media were absolutely full of practically nothing else, with all sorts of emotive words like evil thrown about. Now, I would say what I always say about atrocity stories, which is that the claims about them can be made very easily. Establishing the facts is often a great deal more difficult. And that particular story, I have seen what appear to be retractions from one of the journalists, an Israeli journalist, who apparently was one of the first, or perhaps even the first, to express it. And I understand that the Israeli military themselves are saying that they're not able to confirm the story. And of course, we've had many, many cases, many instances indeed, when claims like that have been made and they have been found to be untrue. I remember, for example, during the 1991 Iraq war, the war between the United States, 1992-1991, war between the United States and Iraq, following the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, there was a very widespread story, one accepted entirely uncritically by most of the media here in Britain, and still sometimes repeated, by the way. I've come across some surprising places where it continues to be repeated, which is that Iraqi troops burst into hospitals in Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait, and tore babies out of incubators which were supposedly going to be looted and sent off to Iraq. And it subsequently turned out that that story was completely untrue. And I can think of many. I remember in particular, that time the internet was working much better, but I can remember reading similar accounts about appalling atrocities supposedly committed by Colonel Gaddafi's troops, Muammar Gaddafi's troops in Libya at the time of the 2011 protests. And again, subsequent investigation found that nearly all of the reports were either completely exaggerated or straightforwardly untrue. And incidentally, and by the way, there have been incidents like that in Ukraine as well. There was a recent missile strike in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. I remember the New York Times did an investigation, and they concluded that the missile strike, which had been immediately attributed to the Russians, the New York Times concluded that in fact it was a Ukrainian air defense missile that fell on the place by accident. By the way, that has not prevented similar claims of Russian missile strikes against other civilian targets in Ukraine being made over the last few days. It seems that the Western media is incapable of learning from the fact that many of these reports of atrocities need to be investigated properly and reviewed properly before one necessarily accepts them as true. Whenever a story like that appears, it circulates at once, and when the facts do get known, well, many months have passed, sometimes years, and of course the story has been revised, but by that time the damage has been done. And as I said, there doesn't seem to be any interest in that. And of course, what concerns me about the spread of these sort of reports about atrocities is that they intensify the emotions and heighten the atmosphere of fear and anger, and that, of course, as I discussed in my video yesterday, makes it more likely that bad decisions made in anger rather than thought through clearly and properly will be made. And in fact, I can't help but wonder sometimes, and I'm not referencing any particular story, whether atrocity propaganda, sometimes that isn't its purpose, to push doubters and people who say stop and think before you act, to push them to one side, to get those kind of voices quieted or even silenced, so that some kind of extreme act then becomes possible. Let me repeat again what I have said before. Just as previous Israeli actions do not justify some of the violent attacks on civilians, which Hamas undoubtedly carried out, and of course abduction and holding hostages of civilians, which Hamas has undoubtedly carried out over the course of its attack of the last few days. So actions like that by Hamas would not justify the perpetration of war crimes. And let me repeat again, war crimes are not only wrong and indeed abhorrent and morally extremely damaging and corrupting to their perpetrators, but they are politically deeply unwise. In some of the reports, some of the proposals that are being made at the moment about the complete clearing of Gaza were ever to be put into effect, well, the effect of doing something like that would undoubtedly echo, and it would make any attempt to try and find a resolution to the problems in the Middle East and to the problem of Israel's long-term security far more difficult. And of course, it would cause enormous degrees of destabilization and chaos in the Middle East itself. So I wanted to say that the rhetoric is, in my opinion, spiraling out of control, and there is no sign at the moment that anybody is trying to create some degree of restraint, though for the moment we haven't yet seen the ground invasion of Gaza, which has been promised. Now, I've had inevitably some pushback from some people about the idea of a ground invasion of Gaza. I've expressed my own concerns about the wisdom of that act, the fact that undoubtedly it would cause enormous numbers of civilian casualties, that it would be an extremely complex and very difficult operation, that Israel itself might suffer very heavy losses, and that this fight might be extremely protracted and might go on for weeks and months, and the outcome of such a protracted struggle might at some point start to look uncertain. To understand how protracted battles of that kind against highly motivated fighters, and everything we've seen about Hamas up to this point suggests that its fighters are highly motivated, and that they are extremely well dug in, that they've created a labyrinth of tunnels, and bunkers and such things in Gaza, which of course they've controlled now for many years. Anyway, to get a sense of how difficult it can be to win an urban battle against fighters like that, take one's mind, one needs to do is to take one's mind back to the protracted the extremely prolonged fight in Iraq, the attempt to capture Mosul, the city of Mosul, from ISIS, which went on for months before Mosul was finally brought under the control of the Iraqi military, and this not before intense missile, artillery and bomb strikes on the city, which of course caused enormous devastation and damage to one of the most important historical centres of the Middle East. Well, Gaza perhaps doesn't have the same architectural importance as Mosul did, and of course there are many people in Israel who might not care about that. But suffice to say again that the Iraqi military, in its capture of Mosul, suffered extremely heavy casualties. And of course, Israel might quite conceivably, or so it seems to me, suffer the same, always assuming, of course, that Hamas is as well organised and as motivated and as dug in as all the reports say. Anyway, I was interested to see today that the former chief of the British Defence Staff, Richard Dannett, Lord Dannett, a military officer, very senior British military officer, somebody with some experience of war, therefore, and some knowledge of military affairs. Anyway, he seems to share the same view that I do, notwithstanding that, of course, I am, as I have said many times, a civilian with little background or knowledge in war. And he says that, this is Richard Dannett's article, it says Israel cannot afford its own Iraq war. In the horror of this tragedy, there are no easy answers, but Israel must appreciate the need to keep on the moral high ground. Well, that's obviously true. They're taking moral decisions should not just be about virtue signalling. It should be because taking moral decisions is the right thing to do. But anyway, I won't get into a deep discussion about that. But anyway, Dannett does make many of the same points that I do. First of all, he talks about the fact that there was an intelligence failure. Well, I think, as I said, that is widely acknowledged. He says that he then makes comparisons with 9/11, and he shares the same misgivings about those comparisons that I do. The view that Hamas's attack was Israel's 9/11 has been widely expressed, but that thought needs unpacking immediately. Yes, 9/11 changed the security environment of the West, but the wrong reaction took the US too briefly into Afghanistan before making the error of biblical proportions in switching focus with a poorly thought through intervention in Iraq. And then he goes on to say, this in turn was the genesis of the nightmare of ISIS. In parallel, the subsequent and belated NATO and US campaign in Afghanistan resulted in strategic failure, culminating in the abject withdrawal from Kabul in August 2021. And he then goes on to say that the Israelis have a totally justifiable motivation to restore the security of the state and the confidence amongst their citizens that they can live in safety. But is another ground incursion into Gaza the right response? What is in the best long-term interests of Israel? These are Lord Dannett's words, not mine. Surely it is an international acceptance that Israel as a sovereign state has a right to exist and that its people should be able to live free from the constant fear of fresh attacks. If that is the correct assumption, how then should that objective be pursued? And of course, what about the rights of the Palestinian people? Now, those again are Lord Dannett's words. And then he goes on to say, given the tinderbox nature of the Middle East an Israeli ground assault preceded by extensive air and artillery strikes will almost inevitably result in not just the hunting down and killing of Hamas leaders and terrorists, but the death of large numbers of Palestinian civilians and the destruction of much of the already impoverished infrastructure of Gaza. Unless this is to be merely a short and violent punitive raid, and the Israelis are not talking as if that is the plan, then Israel is condemning itself to a lengthy counter-insurgency campaign in a highly hostile environment. And that is, again, from Lord Dannett, former head of the British military. Israel can expect to lose very many of its own soldiers, whichever operational course of action the Israeli Defense Forces choose. The optics of the resultant bloodshed will play firmly into the hands of those who funded Hamas in the first place, the leadership in Iran. And then, of course, he goes off on a long discourse about Iran and its role in this affair, real or presumed, and how the Iranians are pulling all the strings, and how Israel might fall into a trap that the Iranians have laid for them. I'm not going to discuss all of that. The Iranian government has again made it absolutely clear that they were not party to this attack on Israel. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, neither Israel nor the United States have proof that Iran was directly involved. That's been confirmed by that piece I discussed yesterday in Politico. But anyway, it suits Dannett, and perhaps he believes it, it suits him to say, and perhaps he also believes it, that it is indeed Tehran that is pulling Hamas's strings. I would have thought, and this is again something I want to say, given what a powerful and violent organization Hamas is, as it has demonstrated over the last few days, I would have thought people ought to be extremely careful in assuming that there is anybody anywhere who is in any sort of position to control an organization like that. And that, of course, applies to the leadership in Tehran or indeed to other actors. But then Dannett finishes, in the horror of this tragedy, there are no easy answers. An eye for an eye is understandable, but in today's nuanced world, the pursuit of peace is far more complicated. So, there we are. Lord Dannett and I disagree about most things. That's, I think, something most people can take as read. We disagree, for example, about the likely role of Iran in this affair. But he, as a senior British military officer, takes the same view that I, a complete civilian, but one who has now been following wars and who has been seeing one disastrous blunder and misreaction to these kind of events after another over the last 30 plus years. Anyway, we've come to the same conclusion, that an Israeli march into Gaza and attempts to resolve the problem in that kind of way at this time doesn't look like it's wise and needs to be carefully thought through. This is not a call for inaction. I understand entirely that the Israeli authorities feel that they need to take steps to secure the security and safety of their people. But I'm not convinced that a military strike, an invasion of Gaza, is the right way. Apparently the previous one that Israel attempted in 2014 did not go particularly well. It only lasted 2 weeks, and over the course of it, 66 Israeli soldiers were killed. Now, what is being talked about this time might be much worse. And beyond that, undoubtedly, Hamas, with its position in Gaza, does pose a very serious security problem for Israel, but there are, I am sure, other ways of addressing it, including political steps which could be taken, as well as the inevitable and very necessary security steps that need to be made as well. Anyway, I say all of this. I understand that these words, mine, Lord Dannett's, the words of other people like me, will not be heeded. The Israeli government will make its decisions. There's apparently work now on establishing a government of national unity in Israel. The country has declared that it is now at war. Some kind of major military offensive strike is inevitable. President Biden of the United States has addressed the American people. I should say, yet again, I was underwhelmed by the quality of his address, but the point is that he gave Israel what looked to me unconditional support from the United States. There have been American envoys traveling to the region. The 101st Airborne Division is apparently being deployed to Jordan. By the way, on that topic, I seem to remember that at some point in the last few months, it was deployed in Eastern Europe, supposedly to prepare for a fight against the Russians. Well, if so, it's been redeployed to the Middle East. There have been massive protests in Jordan, by the way, by the local people against this deployment. They, of course, support the Palestinians, and as does the rest of the Arab and Muslim world. But anyway, President Biden is taking those steps. There's apparently a big military package being prepared. I've seen suggestions that Israel could be supplied or loaned A-10 Thunderbolt ground attack aircraft, the kind that would presumably be used to support a ground operation in Gaza, that kind of thing. And of course, the United States is now also busy deploying aircraft carrier strike groups. One has been deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean. Another is apparently on its way, though it will take 2 weeks apparently to reach the region. But anyway, there is this big show of force being made on signalling Israel, its support for Israel. So all of this is now happening. And as I said, I don't expect the counsels of restraint to be heeded. It's, again, as I discussed before, a runaway train, out of control. The driver is only looking in one direction. And I have deep misgivings about where this will end and how it will go. But realistically, the train of events is now set, and I doubt that there's anything anybody can do or say which will change this. Now, the one thing that perhaps one can say is that for the moment, there doesn't seem to be any real attempt by anyone to widen this conflict. If Hamas was hoping that their raid deep into Israel would provoke a bigger Palestinian uprising, well, there's been considerable rioting. There have been riots in Jerusalem and places like this, but an outright intifada, an event like the Second Intifada, doesn't seem to be happening for the moment. perhaps given the existence of Israel's wall and the various constraints and security structures that have been created in the Palestinian territories, in the West Bank, that is difficult. But anyway, more importantly, so far, Hezbollah has confined its actions to Lebanon. It hasn't moved beyond Lebanon, and though there have been some missile and shell attacks on Israeli positions in northern Israel, there's been nothing concerted from that front. And the same applies in the Golan between the Syrian military and the Israeli military. There have been exchanges of fire, but up to this point, nothing more serious. However, one can't rely on this. The longer this crisis continues, the greater the escalation in Gaza, the more likely it is that the situation could spiral out of control. And of course, going back to that programme Glenn Deason and I have done with Alistair Crook, if possibly there is some kind of further Israeli incursion into the area of the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, if there are more challenges or occupations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or if there are more calls in Israel to restore the temple, and that this gets some traction within, or appears to receive some traction from within the Israeli leadership, then when matters like that are concerned, when that starts to affect people's deepest beliefs, religious beliefs, and their conception of themselves and of the sense of their own identity, well, at that point, escalation, uncontrolled escalation, becomes all but inevitable. There's already reports, for example, that militia leaders from Iraq are speaking to each other, are gathering their forces. Some of them, one of them, a leader from one of these militias, which confusingly also refers to itself as Hezbollah, though it is not, it should be stressed, the same as the Hezbollah in Lebanon. But anyway, it seems that one of these people, one of these militia commanders, is apparently in Lebanon at the moment, where he is conferring with the leadership of Hezbollah. Meanwhile, even as the situation in Israel, and I have to say in most of the West, suggests that heads are anything but cool at the moment, that people are being swept along, other governments are acting far more carefully. Now, yesterday I discussed various statements that President Putin had made, his concerns that that this whole affair has arisen because of the incompetence of US diplomacy, its failure to broker a peaceful resolution of this crisis, despite the fact that the United States has insisted on monopolizing diplomacy in the region ever since the 1970s, when it took steps to exclude the Soviet Union in a way that I discussed in my program yesterday. Anyway, Putin said yesterday that this is the reason that there is this problem. Decades of American diplomacy, decades of American bullying of both sides, of applying pressure, and of not listening to the ideas and the concerns of the local people, but instead of attempting to impose on the Middle East American-conceived solutions. Anyway, those are the things that Putin was saying yesterday, and today he's of course had a telephone call from his old friend, President Erdogan of Turkey, and the Russians have published a most interesting readout of what Erdogan and Putin said to each other. And the readout reads, the leaders, that's to say Erdogan and Putin, focused on the rapidly deteriorating situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone. They expressed their deep concern at the continuing escalation of violence and the catastrophic increase in the number of civilian casualties. Both leaders emphasized the need for an immediate ceasefire by both sides and resumption of negotiations, and expressed mutual readiness to actively contribute to this end. The sides underscored that a long-term peaceful settlement of the Middle East crisis was only possible on the basis of the two-state formula approved by the United Nations Security Council, which provides for establishing an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Now, that is perhaps the toughest statement, or rather the clearest and most concise statement of the Russian position about the crisis in the Middle East that I have seen for many years. It's not fair to say that the Russians ever went back on this. By the way, the Soviet Union voted for Security Council Resolution 242, which is what this refers to, the one that spoke about the establishing of an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, that's West Bank and Gaza, and with East Jerusalem as the capital. Anyway, the Russians have never gone back formally on that formula. But it is fair to say that in recent years they have spoken about it a great deal less. Putin has had good relations with Israeli leaders, including with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he has had especially good relations with the Jewish community in Russia itself. And suffice to say that he has visited Israel, he has visited Jerusalem, he's been to many places, and he's striven to maintain good relations with both Israelis and with the leaders of the Arab countries. He maintains, Russia, by the way, maintains diplomatic contacts with Hamas. The European Union has just declared Hamas a terrorist organization. But Russia has made it clear that despite everything, it will continue with its traditional policy of remaining in contact with all sides, with Israel, with the Arab states, with the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, an old friend of Russia's, and someone who speaks Russian, by the way, but also with Hamas as well. Anyway, that has been the style of Russian policy up to this point. But here we see Putin and Erdogan talking rather differently with each other. Of course, Erdogan is a leader of a Muslim country, and he is himself a practicing Muslim. And we see that the Kremlin has published a readout which on this topic is essentially unambiguous. It says, look, this is the solution. Solution which was agreed way back in 1967. It's enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution. It's not been implemented. That is why we have the crisis that we have at the moment. And of course, going back to his comments yesterday, who's to blame for that? It's very simple. The people who are to blame for that are the Americans. They've never sought a diplomatic solution of the conflict based on these principles. Instead, they pursued unilateral diplomacy, excluding everyone else, and the result is that they've created a mess. So that is now the Russian position. And not by coincidence, because he keeps his ear very close to the ground on Russian matters, John Helmer at Dancing with Bears, John Helmer, of course, being the single most experienced reporter covering Russian affairs, he's actually published a piece. It's called A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, and he discusses the fact that Russia is gradually, very tentatively, rethinking its policies towards the Middle East and is starting to think of Israel perhaps less as a partner than it once did, and is becoming more amenable to looking at this problem from an Arab and Muslim perspective. And Helmer makes points like this. Until now, Russia has never been so silent in the middle of a Middle East war. Russian opinion pollsters are reluctant to reveal how far the country's public opinion is moving away from Israel towards the Palestinians and the anti-American Arab and Iranian side. The silence from the Kremlin reveals how thoroughly the Israelis have burnt their bridges to President Putin, and how far, if silently, the Russian president has moved to the side of the Russian General Staff in their assessment of Israel as hostile on the enemy front with Ukraine, the United States, and NATO. And yes, more to say about this. It's an interesting article, and Helmer makes points like, from his policy of equivalence and equivocation between Israel and the Arabs, Russia has reached the point of engagement on the Arab side. And he goes on to say the drive has been the US war to defeat and destroy Russia through Ukraine. The longer the new Palestinian war lasts, the more clearly Russian military and political strategy in the Middle East will pursue a new anti-American line. The consequences are as great as the defeat of the United States and NATO, which Russia is now inflicting in Europe, and of the Western sanctions war in the global community markets and the trading lanes at sea. And Helmer then quotes some of the same comments that Putin made yesterday in his meeting with the Prime Minister of Iraq, and that, just to repeat again, we are witnessing a sharp deterioration, this is Putin's words, of the situation in the Middle East. I think that many will agree with me that this is a clear example of the United States' failed policy in the Middle East, which tried to monopolize the settlement process. And Helmer undoubtedly wrote his article before the Russian readout. In fact, he did write this article before the readout of the conversation between Erdogan and Putin was published, which, to my mind, essentially corroborates what he says. Anyway, suffice to say that Turkey is not the only important Muslim state that the Russians are speaking to today. There is reports confirmed by the Kremlin that officials, senior Russian officials, are in contact with the Saudis, and that there will be Saudi-Russian discussions over the course of today concerning the oil price and the price of oil. Now, Saudi Arabia has made absolutely clear that it remains fully supportive of the Palestinians. There continues to be a theory widely promoted by some people, including as the British Foreign Secretary William Hague, the former Foreign Secretary, I should say, William Hague, that the Hamas incursion was intended to short circuit, to block the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel that the United States was apparently brokering. I repeat again my own view that from my understanding, those negotiations, which by the way have been misunderstood and misreported, what the United States is quietly offering Saudi Arabia is access to nuclear technology, which of course will eventually, and this is well understood by all the parties, facilitate the development of a Saudi nuclear weapons program. Again, this is a point which I made right at the outset. I understand some other commentators have come to that view also. But if you read between the lines, that is clearly what the discussion between the Americans and the Saudis was all about. The Americans trying to win back the Saudis by trying to tell them, look, we understand you're annoyed with us over many things, but make up with us, distance yourselves from your new friends in Beijing. And we will look the other way if you acquire nuclear weapons. In fact, we'll make it easier for you to access the technology that will enable you to do that. And in the meantime, of course, and in return, please establish diplomatic relations with Israel and also, and by the way, take steps to reduce the price of oil. Now, my understanding is that those negotiations weren't actually going particularly well. The Saudis maybe are interested in these proposals about nuclear weapons, but I suspect that Saudi Arabia already has the means to produce nuclear weapons and has close relations with Pakistan, which of course has nuclear weapons and probably could get the technology very quickly if it needed to, and perhaps the weapons themselves. So I don't think that this was quite as attractive an offer as the Americans thought. And anyway, there were reports that the Saudis were saying that they would not be prepared at this time to establish diplomatic relations with Israel, that a resolution of the problem of Palestine needed to happen first. And I have to say that I think that this incursion that Hamas carried out almost certainly had other causes. The events in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the matters discussed by Alistair Crook in the programme he did with Glenn Deason and me, things of that kind, rather than these negotiations. But anyway, the point is, the Russians and the Saudis are speaking. Saudi Arabia is now taking a very tough line on this conflict. It is clear that it supports the Palestinians. It received, by the way, a Hamas delegation not that long ago. And regardless of that, the Russians and the Saudis, they still have some things of importance to talk about to each other, and that is the supply of oil and the price of oil, which of course in economic terms for the Saudis is an existential matter. So there will be discussions between the Saudis and the Russians, and it is inevitable that there will also be discussions between the Saudis and the Russians about this situation in Israel and in the Middle East, and quite plausibly before long there could be a telephone call between Putin and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in which they will be talking about their joint response to this problem. I personally would not be surprised if Putin not only spoke to MBS, but that at some point over the next few days, he also spoke with, or tried to speak with, Netanyahu, with whom he has long had a cordial relationship. So I think that the Russians will be active in the Middle East, but I think that overall, Helmer is right. I think that from a position of strategic ambiguity, from this moment on, we're going to see Russian policy shifting very carefully, but more towards the Arab states and to some extent away from the Israelis. So that's where we are on the diplomatic and military front in this crisis. There's been a great deal said about the economic consequences of this war. I'm not in a position to discuss that at the moment. I think it's too early to say what the consequences will be. So far, we've not had a wider conflict. As I've said, one can't count on this. The danger of that is very real, and we'll just have to see what comes. But a Russian diplomatic moves, perhaps diplomatic moves from China as well. I'm going to discuss China shortly in other programs. They're obviously following and watching these events with great anxiety as well. But anyway, Russian diplomatic move probable over the next couple of days. As I said, Putin will probably be speaking to all the various leaders, to MBS. He's spoken to Erdogan. He'll be speaking to MBS. He'll be speaking, no doubt, to Ebrahim Raisi, the Iranian president, whom he, by the way, spoke to on unrelated matters just a few days ago before this outbreak started. He'll probably want to speak to President al-Sisi of Egypt, who is, again, close partner of Putin's and whose country, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, is now joining the BRICS. I would not myself be surprised if we saw a Russian Middle East envoy being sent to the Middle East to try to speak to all the various parties and to see what the Russians can do. And there will no doubt also be lots of discussions between Moscow and Beijing, Moscow and Delhi, and who knows, we might even get a diplomatic initiative from the BRICS group as well. But anyway, for the moment, all of these moves by the Russians are interesting. They point in future directions, but the Russians at this time continue to be a side player. The key decisions at the moment are being made by Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government in Jerusalem. That's where they're based. I appreciate most of the world still considers Tel Aviv to be Israel's capital, but Netanyahu's office, and he governs the country from Jerusalem. Anyway, the decisions will be made there and in Washington. And all the auguries strongly suggest that the kind of massive military response that Richard Danner, to some extent I myself, am arguing against, are now on the cards, with all the risks that that creates of a deepening and widening of the war. Anyway, that is the situation at the moment in the Middle East. As I said, it is a deeply upsetting affair. I mean, I've had to watch many dark and troubling films and photos about the war in Ukraine, but at least those pictures have overwhelmingly concerned soldiers, though that doesn't make them not distressing. But of course, when one sees pictures of civilians, also, and one hears stories about civilians being targeted and taken hostage, and of course it's interesting that few people are discussing the fact that on top of the general security crisis, there is also a hostage crisis with some American citizens also apparently taken hostage and held in Gaza. Anyway, when one sees and reads about things like that, it makes one even more distressed. And I have found this a particularly difficult story to cover. But anyway, that is what I now do. And that is what I'm going to say about it today. Now, alongside this crisis in the Middle East, the long-standing crisis in Ukraine goes on. And yesterday there was a massive cascade of reports about a major Russian advance in the area of Avdeevka. I touched on it in my program yesterday, but over the course of the day, more and more reports of intense Russian artillery fire on Ukrainian positions in Avdeevka, of a huge Russian air assault on Avdeevka, lots of bombing and missile strikes and those kind of things. And of course, this is all in itself being done on a huge scale and is symptomatic of probably of a major Russian advance towards Avdeevka, apparently not intent on storming the city itself, the small town itself, but rather encircling the town and trapping the Ukrainian troops there. And this is all happening in conjunction with other Russian advances in other places. Apparently, the 25th Combined Arms Army is now being deployed into the battle lines near Kupiansk and the Oskol River line. Apparently, it numbers some 17,000 men. There's already 2 brigades there, about 8,000 men. So we now have a force of perhaps 25,000, maybe more than that, Russian troops being concentrated around Kupiansk. The Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk are said to number around 15,000, just saying. So that's a 2-to-1 superiority maybe for the Russians, with enormous superiority in terms of artillery and aircraft power and all of that. But anyway, the Russians are concentrating their forces in Kupiansk, still more so in Avdeevka. There were more reports yesterday of further Russian advances in Marinka, that they're gradually, ever so gradually, but now undoubtedly getting on top of the Ukrainian fortifications in this place, in this small town, largely destroyed town, in fact, completely destroyed town. And that the Russians are also slowly pushing hard on Vuhledar as well. That they're gradually, this time, they're not attempting to storm Vuhledar. Their approach instead is more incremental, it's more methodical. They're putting increasing pressure on the Ukrainian forces there. And I saw that for once the Institute for the Study of War in Washington now all but concedes that it is the Russians who are attacking and who have the initiative in every place. Even in the south, there's been reports of Russian advances in the village, near the village of Pyatikhatki in the far west, that's near the Dnieper River. The Russians continue to advance in the Vremivka salient area. Apparently the advance there also goes on, and they've also made some advances in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, though the Ukrainians continue to attack there. And there are some tantalizing reports from some Russian officials that the Ukrainians have deployed some armor in this area. Dmitry Rogozhin, who used to be the head of Roscosmos, Russia's space agency, and Russia's, before that, Russia's military-industrial complex, he now says that there's something between 40 and 60 armored vehicles now concentrated around Orechov, which is a significant armored fist, but actually also one that is significantly smaller than the ones that the Ukrainians deployed against Rabotino in the Rabotino sector back in the early Ukrainian advances in June and July. So, just keeping it in some level of, under some sort of proportion. But nonetheless, there are these reports of Ukrainian concentrations, and there are also reports of the Ukrainians continuing to carry out light infantry attacks towards Verbovoye, where apparently they have actually been pushed back from some of the areas which they'd occupied close to that particular village. And there have been some very sour commentaries about this from the Russians. They say that from Russian sources. I read one which said that the weather is now becoming increasingly cold. At night, temperatures might be falling below zero. That can probably be verified, by the way. I don't know whether it's true. But anyway, the weather is getting cold, it's getting wet, it's getting windy, and yet nonetheless, Ukrainian infantry still trudge towards the Russian defences. There's little in the way of tactics or combat preparations in terms of these advances. That's what the Russians say. And if you also believe what the Russians say, all of these attacks, they result in Ukrainian soldiers being killed and wounded, heavy loss of life. And the Russians say that they are baffled by these tactics, that they do not really understand. If this is really what is going on, and if it is frankly a criminal waste of life, but if this is indeed what is going on, I suspect that it is essentially an attempt by President Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership to sustain the fiction that the offensive is still happening by pressing home attacks in Verbovoye, even if this is done at the expense of the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. Anyway, it's not just the Institute for the Study of War that acknowledges that these Russian attacks are now taking place. So interestingly is the Financial Times, and it says Russian forces pushing ahead with an assault on the eastern industrial city of Avdeevka. Alexander Stupin, a military spokesperson for the Ukraine's southern front, said Russian forces were fighting with all their might to show some kind of success and are trying to surround Avdeevka. The industrial city is home to Ukraine's largest coking plant, which videos posted on social media, Russian social media, by the way, a point I would make. Financial Times doesn't say that, but I can, because I've seen the same posts. Anyway, posted on social media and verified by the Financial Times, showed it was targeted by artillery attacks and airstrikes on Tuesday. Some videos showed plumes of smoke rising from the battered city, whilst those posted by Ukrainian drone operators revealed a convoy of Russian armoured vehicles and infantry moving towards the front lines. Then we're told that Avdeevka's pre-war population was around 30,000. It's been reduced to about 1,000 people who are still there as a result of constant shelling. Ukraine's general staff said that up to 3 battalions of Russian soldiers were involved in the offensive around Avdeevka. That would be around 1,500 men, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 men. And Stupon then is quoted as saying, they're not succeeding, but they will try to gain some operational space. At the moment, they're suffering losses. Our soldiers are standing firm and defending Avdeevka and the neighbouring settlements. Well, Russian accounts, unsurprisingly, are different. They say that the Russians have captured an important strategic height, that they're now overlooking the roads that connect Avdeevka to other Ukrainian positions. And the general implication is that the siege of Avdeevka is tightening, and that before long, nobody's saying how long, but at some point anyway, the Ukrainian forces in Avdeevka will find themselves trapped there. So if this is all true, and if we are seeing a Russian attack on Kupiansk, east of the Oskol River, a Russian attack in Avdeevka, it's in fact highly plausible that we will see grim news from the battlefronts for Ukraine before very long. All this on top of the greatest strategic failure, a fact which I want to emphasize, which is the unsuccessful end, the strategic defeat of Ukraine's offensive. Now, President Zelensky has been on his travels. He's been to Romania, where he received a cool reception. He was not allowed to address the Romanian parliament, which apparently he wanted. He was heckled by a Romanian parliamentarian at one point who asked him, why isn't Ukraine returning territory to Romania, which properly speaking belongs to Romania and which was ultimately seized by Stalin. Anyway, there's been a lot of that sort being said over the course of Zelensky's visit to Romania. And anyway, Zelensky then went from Romania to Brussels, where, of course, he's had a further meeting with Stoltenberg. He and the Ukrainian government have been working overtime over the last couple of days to try to create some kind of connection between the actions that Hamas has conducted in Israel and the Russians, to imply that the fight that Israel is waging against Hamas is the same fight against ultimately Russian aggression, which Ukraine is also fighting. Don't think that is gaining much traction at the moment. But anyway, he's gone on to Brussels. He's having a meeting in Brussels with Stoltenberg and with Western defense ministers. He's managed to wangle an aid package from the United States, but it's only around $200 million worth. And it includes a small amount of shells. We're not told exactly how many. He's managed to wangle a rather more attractive aid package from the Germans, which includes another Patriot missile battery. Germany's running through its missile batteries very fast, or so it seems to me. I think it's already sent Ukraine one, and now it's busy sending Ukraine another with more anti-aircraft missiles. In Germany's case, this decision is, I would say, a good case of extreme political perversity. Chancellor Scholz's government, his coalition government, is now deeply unpopular. All of the opinion polls suggest this, and there have just been regional elections in the important states, very important states of Bavaria, one of the biggest of the German states, one of the richest, and also Hesse. Hesse, also a very rich state, one where Germany's financial hub, the city of Frankfurt am Main, where, by the way, both the Bundesbank, and the European Central Bank are located. But anyway, regional elections took place on Sunday in these two cities. All three of the coalition parties, the parties that make up the coalition, the SPD, the Greens, and the FPD were hammered. They all saw sharp falls in their support. In Bavaria, the SPD is now basically an insignificant rump. It's never been strong in Bavaria, but nonetheless it's been hammered down, and it's seen its vote collapse in Hesse as well. And more alarming, I think, for the German political class is that the overall beneficiary of these elections has been the AfD, a party which many see as having East German roots, though it's actually not created in Eastern Germany as such. It's a party with a more complex and interesting history than that, but not one that I'm going to discuss in this program. But anyway, there's been an attempt in Germany to characterize the AfD as essentially an East German far-right party. Well, the AfD has just shown in these elections, where it came second in Bavaria and either second or third. I think it was third, but there have been variations now in the figures given. In Hesse, it's now clearly becoming a significant political force across Germany. And on top of all of that, apparently there are opinion polls in Germany which say that the German public now wants to see the current coalition lose power. They want it to resign and quit, and they are anxious. This is apparently a widespread sentiment in Germany, as tracked by the opinion polls. They now want fresh elections, a new Bundestag, a new government, one no longer led by Scholz, obviously, one no longer including the SPD, one no longer including the Greens, whose support is also now sharply falling, and the FDP, the Liberal Party, the third party in the coalition. It would do so badly in an election that apparently there's some doubts now that it would even find its way into the Bundestag. Well, there are many explanations as to why this government now is so unpopular. But suffice to say that despite, if you go to the thread, to the linking thread, the thing that connects all of the various factors, the fact that there's a recession in Germany, the fact that there's a deindustrialization process underway in Germany, the war in Ukraine, and Germany's full-throated support for the government in Kiev, is a key, I would argue, the key cause. But nonetheless, and despite that, Chancellor Scholz has come up with another €1 billion package of aid for Ukraine. One which, as I said, I suspect many people in Germany will not be pleased about. For the record, I think that the size of this package and the fact that it includes advanced surface-to-air missiles, including, as I said, another Patriot battery, Germany denuding, stripping itself of its air defences, something which I suspect will not please the German military one bit. But I suspect the reason that has happened is because Chancellor Scholz, in his usual weak and unconvincing way, is trying to push back, hold back against the unending demands that are now being made of him to agree to the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. He's apparently decided to make this some kind of a red line. The word is he doesn't want Ukraine to use this missile against the Kerch Bridge, which it undoubtedly would try and do. But I think it's more to do, actually, with Scholz using this as a red line in order to assert himself over his own coalition, his own increasingly fractious and unhappy coalition. So, since he's not going to supply the Taurus missiles, he supplies Ukraine with the Patriot missiles instead. In my opinion, as night follows day, he will eventually crumble, as he always does, and will supply the Taurus missiles. But anyway, we'll get to that at some other point. But in the meantime, we have Zelensky comes to NATO. He's admitted that the offensive isn't moving as fast as he would like. So there has to be an offensive. That's why we see all these attacks, as I said, in Verbovoye, which the Russians are so baffled by. He's also made clear his concerns that with the attention on the Middle East, Ukraine might receive less attention and less ultimately in the way of support. Stoltenberg and the other NATO officials will no doubt try to calm and reassure him. But the reality is that even those most fervently supportive of Ukraine in the West are now having to fight gravity. The focus inevitably is going to shift increasingly towards the Middle East and away from Ukraine. Now, the administration apparently discovered that yesterday. They came up with a proposal to try to continue to support Ukraine by coming up with some great big jumbo package that would include aid for Ukraine, aid for Israel, and aid for Taiwan in one big appropriation, supposedly making it more difficult for Republicans who strongly support Israel to oppose it. Well, it seems that congressional Republicans have made clear their deep unhappiness about that idea. And I suspect that whoever is the next Republican speaker, and we don't yet know the identity of that person, will be under very heavy pressure to disagree with such a plan. So anyway, that's the reality. Ukraine might continue to hear warm words of support, but the flags that are now being put up on government buildings in Europe and North America, the projections onto buildings are now of the Israeli flag, no longer the Ukrainian. Now, all of that comes alongside another very interesting article in Foreign Affairs, written by Thomas Graham, who is, of course, someone who is another member of the Council for Foreign Relations. He's one of the people, part of Richard Haas, his organisation. He's a distinguished fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and the author of Getting Russia Right. And he's written a long article in Foreign Affairs, which again articulates the view that these people like Richard Haas, people like all those ex-diplomats going to Moscow, having those meetings with the Russian officials, becoming deeply frustrated, but nonetheless trying to find some off-ramp, some way of extricating the United States from this conflict in Ukraine, trying to rebuild a relationship with Russia. Anyway, you can see the thinking behind these people. It's very clearly set out in this article. And I'm not going to read it all because, of course, it's again behind a paywall. And besides, this program has already gone on for quite a long time now. But anyway, let's suffice to say it starts with the words, "What Russia really wants." That's the title. And it goes on to say how Moscow's desire for autonomy could give America an edge over China. China is the true enemy. It is the genuine foe. But apparently, there is a way of resolving all the problems, all the West's problems, as a result of the present quarrel between Russia and the West. Russia has become increasingly close to China. This is a very bad thing. It means that the Chinese are able to concentrate on the United States. It says isolated from the West. I'm reading the word from the article now. Moscow has fallen ever deeper into Beijing's embrace, and Beijing has exploited Moscow's isolation from the West and to cut commercial deals on terms that inordinately favor its interests. Mr. Graham doesn't give examples, and he also says that China has also expanded its commercial ties in Central Asia at Russia's expense. And again, he doesn't give examples of that either. As I was saying, in fact, Putin has just been visited by the presidents of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and he's actually traveling to Kyrgyzstan and is meeting officials there as well. He says that this isn't something that the Russians are happy about. China and Russia have a long history of troubled relations. I am going to push back on that in a program I'm planning to do on locals exclusively. I think that this idea that relations between Russia and China have a long history of troubled relations is a myth. There was a period in the 1960s and 1970s when relations between the Soviet Union and China were extremely difficult, but that is untypical, in my opinion, of the wider relationship. Anyway, Mr. Graham has come up with this theory that the Russians prize their strategic autonomy. He doesn't define exactly what that means, but from what I can understand, I think he means its independence, that the Russians care about their independence, which of course they do. And he has constructed an elaborate and, in my opinion, fantastical structure whereby the Russians have built up the BRICS and worked to establish good relations with the global south and with India as a counterweight to China. As I said, I find that idea fantastic. I haven't seen a single Russian official or commentator ever suggest any such thing. But anyway, Mr. Graham appears to believe it. And then he says that if the harsh reality is that a credible strategic counterweight to China cannot be fashioned for Russia out of any combination of states from those regions, the global south and the rest, because they lack sufficient economic weight, technological prowess, and military might. If Russia wants to avoid strategic subordination to China, it cannot rely on inchoate multilateral groupings that have little chance of rivaling Western-dominated global institutions. Nor can Russia count on highly transactional bilateral relations with countries weaker than itself. The only genuine option is the West, principally the United States. Only Washington and its partners can provide Russia with the commercial opportunities, technological cooperation, and geopolitical options that it needs to preserve its strategic autonomy and avoid becoming a permanent junior partner to China. So that's the idea. That's the new framework vision. The Russians apparently are chafing under subordination from the Chinese, and all that the United States has to do is to treat them with a little respect, as we'll come see in a moment, and offer them technological cooperation, and they'll leap at it, economic and commercial opportunities and technological cooperation, and they'll leap for it in order to avoid becoming subordinated to China. And the article accepts that Putin himself will never acknowledge this reality. His anti-Americanism is too deeply entrenched, and he has lashed his fate to Chinese President Xi Jinping too tightly to seek an opening with the United States, even if it is strategically beneficial. So wait for the day when Putin has replaced that longing for regime change, when I discuss the thinking of these people in the Council for Foreign Relations, that commentator who was talking, that anonymous official who was speaking to the Russians in Moscow, who gave an interview to Moscow Times, an article I discussed weeks ago. This person was talking about the need for regime change in Russia, get rid of Putin, and all of these wonderful opportunities will then become possible. And then the offer that the Russians are going to be given is as follows. Washington should offer to restore normal diplomatic contacts and reopen Western markets to Russian trade and investment. In other words, lift sanctions. At the same time, it should adopt a constructive approach to Russian security concerns and create a respectable place for Russia in Europe's security architecture. Notice no reference here to NATO, no mention of NATO, nothing like that. It's just, again, the Russians given some promises, sugared off with some promises, only a respectable place, but nothing that remotely addresses Russian problems. And then, of course, all this is on condition that Moscow end its aggression against Ukraine by, at a minimum, stopping its bombardment of towns and cities, agreeing to a ceasefire, and helping to prepare negotiations for an enduring settlement. In other words, freezing the conflict. This bargain, we're told, would multiply Russia's options on the global stage, granting it genuine strategic autonomy. For its part, Washington would gain an advantage over Beijing by depriving China of a strategic partner that it can use as a wedge between the United States and its Western allies and partners. Well, I'm going to make a guess that that person who gave that interview to Moscow Times is either Mr. Graham himself, in which case he is one of those people who's going to Moscow, or someone who is very close to Mr. Graham, because the thinking is identical. And of course, this will not fly. It certainly won't fly whilst Putin is there, and that's obviously why the Russians have been told, well, just get rid of Putin and we can sort all of this out. We can come up with all of these arrangements for you. You can have all the trade and business that you like. We'll lift the sanctions, just get rid of Putin and all will be well. And in the meantime, we'll freeze the conflict in Ukraine and, we'll have some talks with you about your security concerns in Europe. But that's the proposal. It's not going to be acceptable to Putin. It is not going to be acceptable to any conceivable Russian leader who now succeeds him. Fundamental mistake that American leaders and commentators make is that they think that Putin, in Russian terms, is some kind of hardliner. As I have pointed out on many occasions, far from being any sort of hardliner, Putin has been, through nearly the entire period of his presidency, right up until December of last year, when he finally put forward his 2 draft treaties, he has been a moderate in terms of Russia's relations with the West, looking to cut deals with the West, looking for some kind of modus vivendi with the West. In Russia, he is not criticised for the hard line he is taking against the West. Those Russians who matter, those who can, are criticising him because he has been too soft with the West for far too long, at least in their eyes. And that is the predominant view of the Russian public as well. When one reads articles like this, one knows with certainty that there will be no diplomatic outcome to the conflict in Ukraine. Well, this has been a long programme. I'm having now to cover 2 separate conflicts, each of colossal importance. This is where I'm going to finish. Apologies again for the length. And in the meantime, let me remind you once more, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. On Locals, by the way, remember I do live streams on Locals at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time every Wednesday. Also, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. This ends me today. There'll be an awful lot more from me soon, of that I have no doubt. In the meantime, all that's left is for me to wish you a very good day.